Okay, so in this section, we'll be covering about CSS selectors. Now, before covering the CSS selectors, I want you to know a few more things. Now, let us come over here. Okay, now in this entire thing is known as an element. Now, an element is formed by using an opening tag, a closing tag, and the values between this opening and closing tag. Now, the difference between this opening and closing tag is that this opening tag basically tells us where the starting point will be, while this closing tag basically specifies the end point. Now, over here, the common difference between these two is that the opening tag is basically having a lesser than symbol and a greater than symbol, and we are keeping this tag name inside this. Now, in the closing one, we are just having the same thing, but after the lesser than symbol, we are having a forward slash. Okay. Now, let us do one more thing. Let us, explore this file. Let us create a new folder and name this folder something as CSS Selectors. Okay. Now, what I will be doing, I can select this CSS selector and then we can create a new file over here like index.html. Now, I will be closing my text styling index file. Okay, now we'll be also creating a style sheet. So we can simply say styles.css, something like that. Now I'll be dragging the styles.css over here and let me close this previous one. So we can close this one. Okay. Now what we'll be doing, we'll be basically generating, a boilerplate. For this, we can simply have this and then press enter. Now we'll be getting this default boilerplate, right? Now we can link this style sheet by using the link tag. So we can simply say link and we have to refer to the styles. So we can simply say styles.css, right? And now we will be having this, right? Now do one more thing. Let us post this on to our browser. So go live. Okay, now we are getting this, right? Now let us focus on the selectors. Now we have seen two selectors till now. The first one was a tag selector, like we were directly selecting a heading or a paragraph. With this, we have also shown or we have seen how we basically use a class selector, right? By using a dot. Now there are one more selector, which is basically known as a ID selector. So let us discuss each one of this. Let us suppose we have a heading and we say something like hello world, right? And now we can save it. We'll be getting this hello world, right? Over here. Now, let us see the first thing, which is a tag selector. So here, the tag which we are using is this h1. Now, we can simply mention h1 and then we can have the curly braces. And now I can specify the font size, something like, 30 pixels, let us suppose. Now, we are having this, right? So we are having this over here. Now, this text is a little bit smaller. So this is how we basically use a tag selector by simply specifying the tag name and then having the curly braces, open and close, and whatever will be between this open and curly braces will be the style element for this h1. Okay. Now the next thing is our class selector. So what we can do, we can create a paragraph and we can simply say dot like a class name. So we can say my para, and now I can have a para and I can say this is a class class selector, okay, and save it. Now we are having this text over here. Now how do we basically select this class? So we can simply come over here, have a dot, and then we can simply say something like my para, as we have mentioned the class name to be my para, and then have an opening and closing tag, and we can specify the font size to be also 30 pixels. And if we refresh, we'll be getting this text, right? So this is how we basically use a class selector. Now, a class selector has a higher precedence over this tag selector. So let us suppose if I have another paragraph over here and I use this paragraph tag. Now, this paragraph tag will also refer to this. And let us say I say font size to be of maybe 10 pixels, right? Now, we have defined the paragraph to be of 10 pixel size, but we have defined the paragraph using class selector and we have specified its font size to be 30 pixel, right? Now what will be applied? Will the 10 pixel will be applied or the 30 pixel will be applied? So as we know, class selector has a higher precedence than that of the tag selector. This selector will basically be applied. So we can refresh and see we are still having the same size of 30 pixel. Now we have one more selector, which is basically known as a ID selector. We can simply say paragraph, and then we can come over here and have the ID. Now the ID can be something like, we can say ID selector, something like that. And let us have a paragraph. We can say this is a ID selector, right? Let us save it. Come over here. Now to use the ID selector, we basically use a hashtag. And after that, we have to name our ID selector. So it was basically ID selector as our name. We can simply say ID selector. Now over here, we can specify its font size, something like maybe 30 pixel again. Now if we do it, refresh, now we are having this ID selector. Now, what is the difference between a class selector and an ID selector? So a class selector can be reused. So like I can have another paragraph over here, and I can have the same class name, like class equals my para. This is having same class name, and still the thing will be applied to this new, this new paragraph, right? So we can reuse a class. This basically helps us to increase the reusability of code, while ID selector are always unique, and we cannot assign the same ID name to two different tags, or we can say two different entities. So an ID is unique to a particular identity. Okay, so like if we are having a paragraph with this ID, then we cannot have another paragraph with the same ID. Okay, now due to this, it is somewhat, we can say, having a much higher precedence over the class, but it doesn't help us to increase the code reusability because the ID name is unique to a particular element. Okay, now the next thing which we'll be learning is that we also have global selectors. So like we can come over here, and after this we can basically have a star, and then in this we can basically use a global selector. Now a global selector is a selector which basically we uses it to apply styles to all the elements together. How we do it? Let us suppose we want to change the color of all the text to maybe red, and if we refresh, see now all the elements are basically having red color. However, this is something which is having the lowest precedence. Now if we come over here and let us suppose we change the color to maybe blue, then this blue will be applied and this red will not be applied. So over here we have arranged all of this according to the precedence. So the first one is, which is having the lowest precedence, is a global selector. After this we have this this tag selector, then we have the class selector, and finally we have this ID selector. So ID selector is the selector which is having the highest precedence, while a class selector is something which is having a lower precedence than of the ID selector. And then we have this tag selector which is even lower than this class selector, and finally we have this global selector which is basically having the lowest precedence, okay, or we can say the lowest power. Okay, so this is all about selectors. However, we have not covered how we can change the selectors. We'll be learning about this as we will be moving on with our sections. Let us jump into the next section now.